Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another episode of the All Out Leadership Podcast. So glad that you're joining us. We're continuing in our leadership lessons on the life of David and what made him the gold standard of leadership. We're looking at principles that positioned him to become a giant killer. We all want to kill giants. We all want to be known for conquering great things as leaders, but there's a bunch of little principles that we need to apply in our life that position us and prepare us to be great, and that's what we're looking at in the life of David. The first week we saw that you have to show up. David showed up on time and at the right place and with the right purpose. Last week we looked at stewardship, how we need to be faithful with the little things that God gives us, and now we're going to pick up with the third principle in the life of David. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 20. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. The third principle we see in the life of David is he was submitted to the authority of his father. Now, I know that word submission, unfortunately, has been overused, and unfortunately, it's been abused. And there are many people who have been hurt by the misuse of authority. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about submitting with no questions asked and blindly just following. That's not biblical, and that's not what we're talking about. But what we are talking about is a healthy biblical form of submission. David submitted to his father's command to go and deliver food and to bring back a message. Basically, he just needed David to be the delivery boy. He was Uber Eats. And David submitted to what his dad asked. Now, when I look at the word submission, here's one reason why this is so important for us as Christ followers. When you look at the word submission, mission is actually the root of that word. When we submit, it gives us mission. It keeps us on mission. Sub brings about the mission of God in our life. See, it was his submission that actually put David in the mission of becoming a giant killer. There's a lot of people going, I don't know my purpose, and I don't really seem to be achieving any mission in life. Well, it might be because you haven't submitted to the authority that God has already placed in your life as a spiritual covering. Kids submitting to moms and dads, and maybe being submitted to just a healthy form of church government and listening to the teaching that your pastor is sharing from the Word of God that's biblically based, and having godly spiritual advisors and influencers in your life, and maybe just following the directions of the boss that you're working for or the staff of which you're a part of. Your mission will ultimately be fulfilled in your submission. Now, you might be going, yeah, but David, his dad wasn't perfect. David's dad really had a lot of flaws. Well, all leaders have a bunch of flaws. And let's just talk about that for a minute. David submitted to imperfect leadership, and we know his dad had some flaws because Jesse had come and was anointing the next king of Israel, and Jesse didn't even think enough of David as a candidate to even invite him to this ceremony. And after Samuel anoints David to even become king, we still see that Jesse doesn't even have respect for David because he just sent him right back out to watch the sheep. And we still see dad just kind of treating him as the errand boy. So we see even dad's attitude didn't even necessarily change about David. And so there were some imperfections in his dad. And maybe you have a leader who doesn't see your potential, doesn't see how gifted I am, doesn't see the calling on my life, doesn't see that I'm talented. A lot of leaders might not see that in you, but know this, God does. And we talked about this. When a leader gets it wrong, God still gets it right. But it was David's submission to an imperfect leader that still put him in the middle of mission. Why does God use imperfect leaders? It's important to answer that question. First of all, God's going to use your imperfect leader to help keep you in God's mission, because God uses imperfect people because at the end of the day, he gets all the glory. Because when we really look at who we are and how God uses us, at the end of the day, it's usually in spite of us more than because of us. And there's times people might come into a weekend church service. They might hear me teach or speak and see what our incredible team produces. And they go, wow, you're amazing, or your team's amazing. And then I could just step back and go, you know what? We're really not that great. It's just God really using us in spite of us. Why? Because God gets all the glory at the end of the day. That's why when we see in the book of Revelation, when people are awarded crowns, what you see is the leaders turning around, casting the crowns back at the feet of Jesus, because we realize it was all by grace, for grace, because of grace, that God used us, because there's only one that's really qualified to receive the glory, and that's Jesus. So God specializes in using imperfect leaders. Now, that should be encouraging for you, because you're also imperfect. Let me say that again. Hello. You're also imperfect, you who judge your boss, your pastor, or your leader. So the good news is God can use them. That means God can use you. Why does God choose to use imperfect people? Because he doesn't have any other options. Because we're all imperfect. So God just works with what he has, and I actually find great encouragement at this. Jesus even submitted to imperfect leaders called his parents. Jesus was 12 years of age. We get a little glimpse into the life of Jesus, just this little window in 30 years of his life. We see him at 12. Mom and dad goes to Jerusalem. They're there to celebrate Passover. They go back. They forgot Jesus, and Jesus is found in the temple. And then I love this dialogue because Jesus goes, did you not know that I needed to be about my Father's business? And they didn't understand. So we pick up in Luke chapter 2, verse 50, but they didn't understand the statement which he spoke to them. Then he went down with them, came to Nazareth, and was subject to them. Then Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. I'm encouraged by this. Jesus submitted, or he was subject to his parents, even though he knew more about the subject. Can you submit to imperfect leaders even when you know more about this subject than they do? There are going to be times your leaders don't understand you. There's going to be times they don't see the whole picture. Can you still submit? Now, I'm not talking again about submission unto sin, a leader getting you out of the call of God, a leader asking you to do something unbiblical or immoral. That's not biblical submission. That would just be sin. We're talking about just when you disagree, when you have a different perspective. At the end of the day, can you still submit? Even if you know more about the subject, can you be subject? Now, let's answer this question, why you might be smarter than your boss. Because most everybody I've met does believe inherently somewhere inside of them that they are smarter than their boss. And the reason you are potentially smarter than your boss is because your boss was smart enough to hire you because you are smarter than them about something, Mr. Smarty Pants, Mrs. Smarty Pants. See, a smart leader hires somebody smarter than themselves. See, I surround myself with people who are better at me than what they do. Every employee should be smarter than me at what they do. That's why I hired them, because I know I'm not the smartest man in every room. Look, the leader that walks into the room and is the smartest person in the room in which he walks in automatically makes him the dumbest person in the room in which he walked in. Because the smartest leader walks into a room full of people smarter than himself. Because a smart leader surrounds himself with people smarter than himself. So here's the temptation I have found that every employee I've ever had, every person I've ever led, and you might struggle with this sometime too if you're working for someone else, and it's this. The temptation you have is to compare your strengths against your leader's weakness. I'm going to say that again. It's really good. I mean, you might even have to pull the car over and just go, wow, that was good. I need to tweet that or post that on Facebook. You can even take credit for it if you share this podcast link. All right. The temptation is to compare your strength against your leader's weakness. See, a smart leader hires other strengths to cover their weakness. Don't compare your strength against your leader's weakness. Try this sometime. Compare your weakness against your leader's strength, because for every weakness your leader has, there's a strength that they have, he or she has, that is stronger than your weakness. So at least be fair if you're casting judgment, okay? So I surround myself with people that are better than me, smarter than me at what they do. That's just called smart leadership. So let's talk about this submission here for a moment, because David got up early and went out as Jesse had directed. Now, some people, when they're given instructions to do, the temptation is this, to do what I call passive-aggressive pouting. I'm going to say it again, passive-aggressive pouting. You don't like what they said, you don't agree with it, but you aren't going to vocalize it, or you weren't listened to when you vocalized it, so it's called passive-aggressive pouting. I'm going to do it. I'm just going to delay in getting it done. I'm just going to kind of take my time in doing it. Well, that's passive-aggressive behavior, and it's not good, biblical, or healthy. David didn't do that. He went out early and got it done, got it on time. Delayed obedience is still disobedience. Had David disobeyed and delayed, here's what happened. He came out because he showed up early. Goliath had just come out, and he was able to see the problem and solve the problem. If David had delayed 1 hour, he literally might not have seen Goliath and would have just gone back and remained Uber Eats delivery boy. But because he was on time, he submitted, he was there on time to see an opportunity, and God used it to catapult him into the annual histories of greatness, because delayed disobedience is still disobedience. He showed up on time because he submitted, because mission is found in submission. Look forward to seeing you next week as we continue this leadership principles from the life of David for promotion. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.